I'm going to wait a few seconds for the recording to start, and then we should be good. Okay. Hi, I am Micah Mathews. I'm currently doing my TOK presentation, and it is going to be a discussion on the approach of societal progress. And so to start it off, we are going to be talking about our real life situation. And so the situation I'm going to be talking about today is the increasing wage inequality resulting in harsh living conditions and working situations in China. And this is concurring while China is in an extreme economic expansion period. So just to elaborate a little bit on this, talking about the income inequality, the average rate of like per capita and national income increase for China for the top 0.001% is significantly higher than it is for the bottom 50%. So this shows that the income inequality is increasing. And then just to further my point a little bit about how the living conditions are bad, despite the rapid growth of the Chinese economy in the last decade, the last 25 years, the last 50 years, more than 482 million people in China live on less than $2 a day, which, as you know, living in America is enough to get you a Whopper and a half, maybe. But one of the primary goals of China is to reduce this wage gap. And since 2012, and especially in the rural areas, the people who are lower wage, generally speaking, have increased their wages up to 30% in the last couple of years. And so it shows that Chinese priority is to decrease the wage rate. And this makes sense because they are an economy with the collectivized economy. And this just shows that in the long term, they might end up being fine. So next. And so my knowledge question is going to be, to what extent can ethical considerations for individuals be disregarded in the pursuit for the betterment for the whole? And so basically what I'm asking is that, can we prioritize the entirety of the group of people while pushing down a small minority? And so I think this pretty clearly relates to the Chinese situation, because in China, overall they are doing better and incomes are increasing, but there is a minute and small section that is not really living their best. But overall, China as a country is doing better. And this is talking about whether having the gain as a whole is validated, even at the cost of other people. And so now I'm just going to talk about the areas of knowing and ways of knowing that I'm going to be using. And so for the ways of knowing, which is basically how do we know things, out of the 8 of the ways of knowing, I'm going to be choosing reason, which is just to work out things logically and go beyond what we've been using with our sense perception. And then intuition, which is kind of the inverse of reason. And it's kind of that gut feeling that we know. And you're going to see how this applies to the presentation later, but specifically for the knowledge question, this applies because we want to logically induce what the correct manner to advance society is using reason. And then with intuition, we humans have an inherent gut feeling that would allow us to determine if what is happening feels right in our human minds and human empathy, which is something we inherently have. And then for the areas of knowing, which is just what do I know, we're going to bring back to history. And this makes sense because we're going to look at what has happened in the past with past figures, past historical people, and just past events in general, as well as ethics, which is just knowing the difference between right and wrong. And it's something that we demand of all society members, and that's present in all societies. And there necessarily isn't a right answer, but it's obviously relates because this is a moral dilemma, the treatment of people. And so our first knowledge claim is going to be that utilitarian society is valid as an ideology for progression of society. And so I think I'm just going to start by talking about what is utilitarianism. And it's honestly not terribly complicated. It just means that every action has some kind of utility, which basically means it has intrinsic worth, and that most of the times this utility is considered a form of happiness. And it's basically saying that if my action leads to some sort of benefit for me and general society, then it is justified. And so we're going to be talking about the trolley analogy, which basically means that a train is about to run over one person and you have the ability to switch it, or it's about to go over 5 people, you have the ability to flip the lever and have it go over one. You are choosing to save the 5 people, but you are killing the one. But the idea that the ends justify the means is all about what utilitarianism is about. And so now we're going to be talking about Jeremy Bentham, who is basically the father of what utilitarianism is. And he was basically a man who was for welfare and for redistribution of wealth and democracy, because he thought that even though it may seem immoral to redistribute the wealth, is going to be beneficial for the entirety of society. And so an example of this, there are plenty of them, like wealth redistribution, which I said. Pollution would be another one, because we are a progressing society, even though it causes harm to the environment. But what I'm going to focus on is criminal justice. And so we see criminal justice as we execute people like the Boston bombers we saw in recent history. And so by executing these people, we are ridding an alleged bad person from society who is potentially endangering these people. But killing people is something that we've induced that is immoral. But due to the effects of killing these people, therefore it is moral. And so you might be wondering to yourself, how does this reflect back to the knowledge question? Well, this reflects back because we're looking at this in the sense that, can beating a few of the Chinese citizens down and having them live a rough life for the benefit of majority of China, is that justified? Do the ends justify the means in that sense? And there are times where this utilitarian idea is effective. And so we see the WOKs as the one previously stated, history, talking about the Boston bombing murder, as well as ethics, thinking about the ethical concerns of killing them. And then, reasonably speaking, we believe that executing the Boston bombers is valid because we're saving people. And intuitively, for most people, it'll probably feel right because they are detrimental to society. But the counterclaim is that deontology is a valid ideology for the progression of society. And so you might be wondering to yourself, what is deontology? And so deontology is basically the opposite of what utilitarianism is, and it is a ethics in which actions are inherently considered morally good because some sort of characteristic of the action itself, and not because the product of the action is good. And so, as I previously said, it's the opposite of utilitarianism, and it basically says that ends don't justify the mean. Each action has some moral value, and it's either morally correct or incorrect. And the people who decided this are deontologists themselves, and they just write countless essays on whether they believe it is. But the founder of deontology is Immanuel Kant, and he's actually a guy who opposed democracy, which basically meant direct democracy, which meant that the majority would choose stuff. And he believed that this was a threat because he didn't necessarily believe that majority was right and what the ends of the majority wanted were not justified in the means. And so that just gives us an idea of the bias that we're facing with Immanuel Kant. In the trolley analogy, Immanuel Kant's point of view would be that I'm not going to switch the lever to save the 5 people, because then I would be murdering the one person, which is true because you would be knowingly killing that one person, and therefore it would be immoral. And so laws are a good example of deontology because we say things like theft, murder, and tax evasion are inherently wrong, and we have established these things as wrong. However, on case-by-case basis, there may be a period of time where theft is legally obligated, but that's not something that Immanuel Kant and deontology would argue. And I think laws are a good example of this because laws say that these things are more morally inherently wrong. And so how does this reflect back to the knowledge question, is what you may be thinking. And this reflects back because someone like Immanuel Kant would deem that pushing down the lower class of society in China is inherently wrong regardless of how China might benefit from this action. And so the WKs and AOKs, once again, we look back at some past things talking about laws that are created in the Constitution. And then ethics are obviously present because of the ethical analogy of killing a person and saving 5 as a result of it. And so we use reason in this sense because we have to reason that whether the action is has moral hierarchy and is morally acceptable. And we have to reason that, and we are intuitive because a lot of times with these moral actions we're deciding the value on, we have this intrinsic feeling internally of whether these are valid or not. And so my answer to the knowledge question is it's neither deontology or utilitarianism. This is because it may not be right to push down all the people, but to say that we cannot have people struggle in society is almost an impossible task. And so I think that we should infuse both of these answers in order to determine that we can find a balance of helping the bottom of society without slowing down the progress of the entirety of society, which would be a fusion of deontology and utilitarianism. But one possible issue with my answer is that this idea would be pretty similar to Canada, America, and Western society, which is the thing I've been influenced by the most. And so maybe my personal bias of growing up in this area and seeing how we do have welfare, but not so much that it slows down the progress of society would would um would hurt us. And so just again to say the knowledge question is that we have to mix these things together and it's not one or the other. And so answer's implication to the RLS. We basically transfer my answer of mixing the two ideas into China's government. So this would mean that we increase wages of the lower class workers in rural areas and factories in order to give them a better standing of living, which would be moral in the sense of utilitarianism. However, we wouldn't do this to where the firms would be unprofitable and close, because this would contradict the idea of redistribution of wealth is inherently evil in deontology. So and this can apply to almost all societies because currently in the world there are no societies with no lower class. And generally speaking, when we're dealing with human rights and how people should be treated, this can apply to all areas. And so these are my sources. Thank you for listening to my presentation.